welcome. My name is Julian Freitag, and I am Assistant Professor for American Studies here at the University of Mainz at our Germersheim campus. And I am one of the initiators of the Time and Temporality in Theme Parks Research Project. And my colleague, who unfortunately cannot be here with us today, is Filippo Carla, who is Junior Professor for Ancient History here in Mainz. And in cooperation with the Center for Intercultural Studies, Mainz, Professor Carla and I have invited Professor Scott Lucas from Lake Tahoe Community College in California to come to Mainz for a guest professorship. And as you can see, and much to our delight, Professor Lucas has accepted our invitation. His lecture tonight will be his second lecture here in Germany in the context of this guest professorship. He gave his first lecture yesterday in Germersheim, and now he has come to our main campus. And before he will start his lecture, I would like to tell you something about Scott Lucas. He is a professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Lake Tahoe Community College in California. And he is a true expert on theme spaces in general and on theme parks in particular. He received a BA in anthropology from Indiana University, an MA in anthropology from the University of Iowa, and his PhD in cultural anthropology from Rice University. Scott Lucas is also a former theme park trainer at Six Flags Astroworld. And his work in the theme park industry was also the subject of his doctoral dissertation, which was entitled Signal 3, named after a theme park radio code. And unfortunately, yesterday I forgot to ask you what the code is all about, so maybe today I'll remember to ask you. Scott has published chapters and articles on a variety of topics in different journals and in different collections. But here I wish to concentrate on three of his books on theme spaces. And the first one that I want to mention is The Theme Space, Locating Culture, Nation, and Self, which was published in 2007 and which collects 15 articles on theme spaces such as Coney Island's Luna Park, Japanese love hotels, and flagship locations by popular brands. 1 year later, Scott Lucas published The Theme Park, which is a richly illustrated book that lucidly examines the theme park from a variety of perspectives, including the theme park as machine, the theme park as brand, and the theme park as text. And now finally, the Immersive Worlds Handbook, Designing Theme Parks and Consumer Spaces, published in 2013, is even more visually stunning. It uses numerous charts and illustrations, and it is a how-to guide for designers on how to create immersive and themed spaces. Over the years, Scott Lucas has received several awards, and most of them for his teaching. In 2003, he was honored with the Hayward Award for Excellence in Education in the state of California. Two years later, he was the recipient of the McGraw-Hill Award for Excellence in Undergraduate Teaching of Anthropology by the American Anthropological Association. And in fact, just a few days ago, he received the Lake Tahoe Community College Distinguished Faculty Award 2013. Congratulations. So you can see, we are very proud that he's here with us today to talk about research methods in consumer spaces. So please join me in welcoming Scott Lucas.
Thank you, Dr. Freitag, for the generous introduction. And thank you all for coming today, taking your time and coming to listen about this topic, which is close to my heart, obviously, researching consumer spaces. And I did want to mention that the full version of this talk, a much longer version, in fact, about 8,000 more words, which has more context and information, is available for download here. I know it's a very long address to look at, but if any of you would like to get that, you can we can exchange emails afterwards, and I can send you to the longer version, which I think gives a bit more context. Okay, so I'll begin. The images pictured in these slides depict something of a typical research encounter that occurred earlier this year. For many years, I've been studying the nature of everyday consumer spaces: theme parks, restaurants, casinos, interpretive centers, museums, shopping malls, lifestyle stores, and a myriad of other spaces that reflect the use of theming or other innovative narrative approach to consumer spatial organization. I'm a cultural anthropologist who has also worked as an employee trainer at a now closed Six Flags theme park called Astroworld, which was located in Houston, Texas. Returning to the images here, let me add that this scenario that I'll be describing played itself out at Downtown Disney in Anaheim, California. The setup is quite mundane. Cultural anthropologist studies consumer spaces, seeks more media for YouTube channel, pictured here, that is watched by very few people, goes to space to collect more media to upload to YouTube. I will discuss the specific use of new media in the context of consumer research of this sort later. But let me now offer that this use of media, specifically my digital camcorder, is what gave this particular incident significance in terms of contemporary research in consumer space. Prior to this event, I had recorded 2 to 3 of my typical short clips. Each introduces an idea about the consumer space at hand, perhaps an example of how an architectural facade is used or the content of a narrative that governs a given space, and then suggests to the viewer the value of visiting and analyzing this very space. I have always thought of a small part of these YouTube videos as being free publicity for the space being considered, as they tend to rhetorically follow a positive, somewhat celebratory narrative. But this isn't necessarily the view of the people who operate these spaces, as I soon discovered here. On filming my third feature, about 1 minute into it or so, I began to notice the presence of a converging mass of security guards. 3, actually, so not exactly a mass, but there was something menacing about their presence and their garb, which connoted a mix of social control and guest-centered friendliness. As the 3 guards approach me, I note in my small viewing screen that they are walking directly at me, but their faces are directed 45 degrees from my point of view, each smiling as they approach me about 20 yards out. When they finally enter my personal space, I note that they have formed a half circle around me and discover later that a few of them have their hands on their belts. Mace, perhaps, or some sort of communication device. I cannot be sure. How is it going? Only one of the guards, the fellow on the left who appears to be the lead, speaks to me. The others smile, somewhat uncomfortably, and one continues to keep his hand on his belt. "Great," I respond, "just filming some YouTube videos." "Yes," the lead says, "we noticed that, and this is why we stopped you. We were concerned about that." I realized that I didn't bring, at that moment, any of my business cards to hand out, but explained that I have this great new book called The Immersive World's Handbook, and I was filming one of hundreds of features that celebrate the theming, architecture, and design of innovative consumer spaces. I further explained how these features work, but was cut off by the guard who said, "We think that what you're doing is a little strange." "Strange?" I exclaimed. "I'm a researcher." Incidentally, it occurs to me that there is something strange about research indeed, but this is a sort of institutionalized strangeness that plays an important role in how we researchers innovate, but I didn't mention this during this encounter. Anyway, I was then given a few paragraphs that seem to have been memorized from a Disney security handbook. All the matters about how my research is disrupting the enjoyment of other guests, and that if I want to do such future videos, I will have to call a 1-800 number and then go through the process of securing permissions. Mind you, the whole time this is occurring, I'm about 100 yards from another guest whom I had noted earlier had an entire tripod and camera set and was filming unabated by Disney security. Perhaps he had secured permission to look, perhaps he had secured permission for these videos or his filming, or looked palpably less strange than I had. I was then told by the guard that I could stay in downtown Disney and look around, but I was forbidden to use my camera. I walk off straight to the parking lot, muttering something under my breath like, "You call this public space?" And a key metaphor for this talk today is that we, the researchers, are no longer entirely in control of our research. This is a general theme that can be identified in many facets of social science research, whether conducted in public popular spaces or not. The point, which I will expand on, is that there are wide-scale, game-changing sorts of shifts in media, popular culture, public space, and existential reality that necessarily impact, and often at dramatic levels, the study of consumer space. Some time ago, I developed a chart that would express a number of the emergent issues that I believe are currently impacting the research in public spaces of consumption. I've listed them here in this chart. And again, these are represented on the website I can give to you so you can look at this more closely. And I'll be referring to some of these during the talk today. These are quite the melange of issues, and I suggest that as we look at this chart, that we not consider it to be all-inclusive in terms of the field of consumer studies. These are issues that I have selected as representative of the two worlds that I have inhabited. That of a researcher of themed spaces who seeks out the foundations, language, and approaches of designers who create these spaces, and of a student and now teacher of critical social science who participated in the tail end of the late 1980s critique of ethnographic representation located at Rice University and sometimes referred to by the writing culture or postmodern anthropological critiques label. There is something else I should note about the development of the context of these emergent issues, and this is summarized in this chart. The emergent issues that we will consider have impacts on multiple phases of consumer research. I classify these in three main categories: on-site or in situ methods, analysis at the pre- and post-field research stages, and writing and representation, the traditional vocation of ethnography in cultural anthropology. I plan to discuss the specific context of these two charts in terms of yet another table or chart that I have laid out here. The main areas of concern include cultural remaking, everyday experimentalism, personalization, and the politics of space and research. As well, there is a fifth area of what I will consider to be some of the future possibilities of consumer space and its study. In some cases, I will be glossing over some of the specific topics rather quickly, and again advise you, the reader, to consult the much longer version of this paper available on the internet. And these are just the list of those topics. During my stay here in Mainz, I will be offering a course called Cultures of Remaking, which meets incidentally for the next 4 Saturdays in case any of you are interested. This course grows out of my research in remade spaces, theme parks and other themed and immersive spaces, as well as in forms of media, like film and video game remakes. What fascinates me about remaking is the fact that any remake establishes a connection, whether firm or soft, between one form and a second or third or fourth or additional form. Here then are a few indications as to some of the ways in which forms of cultural remaking impact the design of consumer spaces, and also some of the ways that new research protocols may be appropriate to studying these new areas. The first is expansion of spatial approaches and theming. Theming has been one of the most popular approaches to the spatial and experiential organization of consumer space. As this theme map of Las Vegas illustrates, the themes used to organize spaces are varied and multi-referential. Theming, which may be connected to place, culture, association, mood, brand, lifestyle, or interest, creates some of the most evocative experiences within space. One of the reasons that theming has remained a popular approach to consumer space is the fact that it carries with it complex possibilities of meaning, experience, and performance. As this chart indicates, theming draws on the many associations that it carries, including ideas in the minds of guests, workers, designers, and the many others who proliferate the worlds of popular culture. Interestingly, in recent years, some forms of theming in consumer space have been on the decline. This is certainly the case in some of the casino spaces along the Las Vegas Strip, as illustrated in a recent academic discussion of this in the Bellagio Gallery of Fine Arts show 12+7, Artists and Architects of City Center. As noted in the show, with City Center, Las Vegas moves out of the realm of the misunderstood and underappreciated in terms of its cultural offerings. Instead, City Center's fine art collection, along with its collection of significant buildings, will become a benchmark for enlightened development here and around the globe. What this quote identifies is the growing sense that theming may become staid, old-timey, perhaps childlike, as in the case of the Treasure Island, Luxor, and Excalibur along the Las Vegas Strip. As I am addressing throughout my stay in Mainz this summer, there is a need for more developed, analytical, and methodologically rigorous work on theme and immersive spaces. One of my major concerns is in regard to develop more EMIC, or insiders-based research that focuses on the day-to-day and on-the-ground experiences with consumer spaces. Such ethnographic studies would likely lead to a second important category of work on consumer spaces. This involves the development of more complex models of theming and immersion, especially at the levels of design, including the dynamics of theming as these spaces are conceptualized, reworked, and implemented, guest and worker, including their interactions with the spaces, themes, and experiences, politics, including new models of criticism, such as ethnographic complicity, and authenticity, or more specifically, the idea of post-authenticity. There is also a blurring of space that has transpired. More and more, consumer spaces indicate tendencies towards the playful, the complex, ambiguous, ironic, and they manifest new and powerful connections with technology, media, and social media. Additionally, spaces like the theme park have come to influence museums, theme parks, and other variations. Blurring thus reflects a growing tendency in consumer space in which the former pure products have given way to hybridity, multiplicity, and heterogeneity. One example of such blurring of consumer space is found at 139 Norfolk Street in New York City, in the United States. This particular space, as pictured here, has extended the pop-up retail concept to new levels. In some cases, the space is a wedding chapel, in others, an indoor drive-in theater, in others, an office party space for those without offices, and in others, a place simply to play ping pong. This space literally blurs its inherent nature and questions of us, what is a consumer space? What are your expectations of it? And perhaps, how can we go against those expectations and create a conceptually interesting space that, at a meta level, challenges what we know of consumer space? Yesterday, in my talk on the magic history of amusement parks, I closed with the examples of the Museum of Jurassic Technology and Dennis Seaver's house. These are two spaces which emphasize what could be called an experimental approach to themed and immersive space. Here, the word experimental has two meanings. The first is that of empiricism, or the use of methods to understand and document the world, this being the traditional pursuit of science. The second is that of experimental art and performance, that which engages with the world in a variety of ways to change, alter, or remix it. In this section on everyday experimentalism, I will attempt to merge these two meanings of experimentation and connect them to the context of consumer space. An important topic in these regards is the ways in which forms of experimentalism have entered everyday life. For many years, since my days as a graduate student, I've been interested in the transformative potentials of the avant-garde. The groundbreaking work of the Surrealists, Dadaists, Situationists International, Fluxus, and many other performative movements throughout the 1960s established new precedents for analyzing, understanding, responding to, and reworking of reality. While the avant-garde has been influential in many circles, most notably in the worlds of space and research that I am addressing today, there has been concern that their approaches champion obscurity, perhaps promote antisocial behavior, as in the example of a person who might commit him or herself to the life of an authentic Dadaist, and lend themselves, ironically, as Paul Mann notes, to being subsumed into the institutional structures of everyday life. It is in this last instance that I see the greatest resonance with the considerations at hand today. In terms of consumer space, to what extent can avant-garde influences be determined, and to what degree are these effects and their ultimate sense of being situated in the architectural, material, performative, and other forms as outcomes that can be considered anti-institutional in the original avant-garde sense? As well, to what extent are the research and writing approaches of contemporary analysts and researchers influenced by any of the experimentalism of the avant-gardes? And addressing this first area, that of the impact of the avant-gardes on space, let me turn to this table. Here, I am interested in looking at the issue of how traditional consumer space is constructed And, at least conceptually, how can an avant-garde transformation of that space be or appear? I will be somewhat brief in analyzing these issues, and will return to them in my talk next week on theme parks and social justice, which is next Thursday. I have attempted to chart some of the major ways in which consumer space is organized. We may consider the meaning governing the space. Consider an example of a guest moving through the multi-sensory, though linear, ride, Pirates of the Caribbean. Both the literal and metaphorical meaning of the ride support a meaning that is linear, A to B. One is confined to a boat that rides along a track, one moves from the entrance to the exit of the ride, and one is told a story of heroism in battle, with traditional plot and characterization. We could contrast this space with one that appears to be more avant-garde in nature, such as Dennis Seaver's house, as I have previously mentioned. In the case of this space, the movements of the guests are not directly dictated by those working at the space. One is free to roam, wander, and reflect. The meanings contained in the space are obtuse, difficult to determine, perhaps not fully determined in advance by their riders. We might then say that both in literal and metaphorical senses, Dennis Seaver's house promotes a rhizomatic approach to meaning, allowing the guest to chart an unpredictable path that changes, as does the meaning achieved throughout the space. We may extend this analysis to the architecture of a space. In a traditional one, like the Pirates of the Caribbean, we note that the architecture commonly serves the functional purposes of the space, such as in the example of the Q house that is directed to control the flow of the guests throughout the space in an efficient, if not Tayloristic manner. Even when themed with the narrative of the space at hand, we may be suspicious with the uses of theming that are geared at the larger goals of efficiency and control. Likewise, when the guest completes the ride and exits the space, he or she is pushed through many of the ubiquitous gift shops, pictured here, that are also themed, yet serve the purpose of expanding on the consumptive patterns of the guest. I would contrast this gift shop with the one from the Museum of Jurassic Technology, which is more ironic in concept. And for those of you who heard my talk my reference in the talk yesterday about the mysterious bat that moves through solid walls, you can actually purchase here a souvenir of this marvelous bat going through the walls at the museum. Now, quite in line with the considerations of everyday experimentalism in space is the topic of alternative space. Due to time constraints, I have summarized a range of topics and approaches of this sort of space, though I would say that these separate forms are not as dynamically related in the real world as they do present them to be today. I have already featured a number of contemporary spaces that are both consumer and alternative space. Most interesting to me are consumer spaces that have some attention to irony, experimentalism, darkness, postmodernism, mysticism, flux, openness, and many other foci that are summarized in this chart. Bonbon Land, a theme park outside of Copenhagen, Denmark, is one such interesting space that characterizes an approach to dark theming as it references what Georges Bataille would have denoted as the low, base experiences like defecation, vomiting, and the like. We might call Bonbon Land Rabelaisian in terms of its use of humor and the body. Certain casino spaces have also taken to the Rabelaisian approaches, as in this example of the restroom from the Las Vegas Hilton. Other casino spaces, like those of the new City Center complex in Las Vegas, have featured somewhat postmodern architecture, here with Daniel Libeskind's crystals and interior design, here with David Rockwell's postmodern trees on the inside of crystals. These and many other examples of alternative space offer some of the most exciting new directions for the experiences of consumer space. Greater and more complex integration of the guest in the space, the desire for the guest to be part of a more open and potentially transcendent narrative within space, emphases on new themes that are disturbing, transgressive, even depressing, are but a few of the ways in which alternative space may promote different forms of guest experience. For the researcher, such spaces will necessitate perhaps less modernistic models of space, divergent understandings of the meanings and semiotics of the space, and new transgressive models of ethnography and research that situate the researcher in places of mystery, discovery, and transcendence that mirror the experiences of the guest. Many forms of experimentation in the consumer world are taking place through these modalities of media, social media, and forms of ubiquitous technology. The development of blogs and microblogs like Tumblr, the proliferation of quick and aesthetically attractive apps for photography such as Instagram, the everyday uses of cameras and cell phones that offer immediate uploads to Facebook, Flickr, and YouTube, and other social media and media sites, in my mind, are welcomed advances in the consumer worlds of the guest. I find it especially exciting to be able to review the pages of everyday people who express their own sensibilities about the many sites that I study and to incorporate these in my research. And these are some of the pages of my personal sites, such as Pinterest and Tumblr and also YouTube, that I utilize as part of my research. One of the most significant transformations of consumer space involves the increased connection of the consumer's life world to the space itself, what might be called the personalization of consumer space. Personalization suggests immense changes to both the nature of consumer space and the ways in which it may be studied by social scientists. Social media and the idea of mobility have had numerous impacts on the consumer spaces of the present. I was reminded of this during a research trip to the Las Vegas Strip. Very innocuous, near the check-in desk of the New York, I noted this social media station, pictured here. Indeed, at a time in which the old-timey lion exhibit was on its way out at the MGM just across the way, the ushering in of this new attraction signaled to me the sense that social media had begun to make its impact on the Strip. Of course, over the last 5 years or so, any visitor to the Strip would note the constant uploading of images to Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and the like, as well as the common texting, twittering, and checking in Strip venues. But this sort of invasion of space by a clear purveyor of social media was quite astounding to me. Connected to social media is mobility, which is a trope of architecture, material culture, and technology, and which has some of the most potentially dramatic impacts on our senses of consumer space. Disney, Universal, and other theme park companies are well in the way of developing mobile apps that allow for direct interaction with the spaces in their parks. Disney's Magic Band is one example of these current uses. These uses suggest that consumer architecture is not bounded by static buildings, facades, and landmarks. Narratives can be quickly altered and adapted in line with the interaction of guests with more permanent spaces, and the possibilities of augmented reality, such as through Google Glasses pictured here, is an additional opportunity to turn the consumer space on its head. Already, MGM casinos and resorts have said that they will ban the use of Google Glasses from table game spaces in their casinos for obvious reasons of the dangers of card counting. But once the social control issues are sorted out, it is clear that mobile media and augmented reality will have a very pronounced impact on the nature of consumer space. One interesting opportunity for designers is to allow guests in the space to add on and comment on space and attractions within it. The palimpsestuous opportunities for more democratic space abound. Of course, one such concern of such citation and journaling of space is that the corporate narrative is given over to more and more sources. The result is a sort of convergence culture, as Henry Jenkins would say. Not bad, we postmodern theorists would say, as this results in a more polyvocal consumer texture space. But for the designer or operator of space, this could result in decline of the God's eye narrative of the space as it gets lost in a Gadamerean or Janaean hermeneutics. For researchers, there is great opportunity for new forms of research that places mobility, in situ citation, and social media accounts at the center of our picture. I wanted to reference 3 other contexts of personalization that have also have the potential or do have the potential for radically altering the consumer research landscape. One pictured here is Grant McCracken's notion of the culturematic, or the ways in which everyday people conduct research of a sort and how this practice creates new forms of culture. Examples include the many media, social media, technological, and aesthetic experiments on the internet. A second is Kevin Roberts' idea of the love mark, which creates, quote, loyalty beyond reason, and focuses on brand experiences that command respect and love. Mystery, through stories, dreams, myths and icons, sensuality, particularly through the senses, and intimacy through commitment, empathy, and passion are the three components that will result in the most effective brands according to Robert's notion of the love mark. And lastly, the third is Henry Jenkins' idea of convergence culture, or, quote, the flow of content across multiple media platforms, the cooperation between multiple media industries, and the migratory behavior of media audiences who would go almost anywhere in search of these kinds of entertainment experiences that they want, end quote. Importantly, Jenkins points to the ways in which consumers, or guests in our immersive spaces, have the opportunity to have more dynamic interaction with consumer forums. No doubt these three examples of personalization will begin to have more pronounced spatial impacts on our world. Analysts, too, will benefit from a renewed focus on the ways in which consumer spaces have become more dynamic, intimate, and participatory. A very apt metaphor for new models of collaboration and shared decision-making within contemporary ethnography. In my talk next week, Theme Parks from Cultural Remaking to Social Justice, I will be addressing the explicit political and critical context of theme parks and theme spaces in the hopes of offering new models and visions of immersive consumer spaces. Today, I do wish to also address this important context of the politics of space and research, for I do believe that among the tendencies impacting consumer space and its study, this is one of the key areas. I begin here with this image of a typical IKEA store. The democracy by design slogan has been powerfully appealing for IKEA. For some consumers, the idea of manually assembling particle board furniture and contraptions from IKEA may indeed represent a, quote, democracy by design. Though, as I discovered in the numerous parodies of the ubiquitous IKEA product assembly instructions, not everyone is so convinced of this merging of political realities and consumer space. And of course, the funny thing here is it's a IKEA kit how to build Stonehenge, which looks quite challenging, I would say. In an interview for the PBS Frontline documentary The Persuaders, cultural theorist and analyst Naomi Klein speaks to a telling phenomenon of contemporary branded spaces, their unbrandedness. As she says, they took the brand further, of course, with the planned community Celebration Florida, where you pick up the kids and move inside the brand. I find it really interesting that Disney describes Celebration as a tribute, a celebration of public space. What's interesting about Celebration Florida is that there are no brands there. Once you actually achieve brand nirvana, what you want to do is seal the exits. There's no competition. You've got full synergy, full vertical integration, and there's no need for marketing. What Klein points to is the fact that more and more consumer spaces seem to conceal their intentions from us. Spaces, even when branded and fully part of a consumer empire, may seem natural, homey, and comfortable. Consider the fact that Starbucks has become one of the most successful brands in part due to the fact that it has toned down its brand and has heightened atmosphere, affect, and the mood of its stores. We may contrast the examples of Starbucks being recognized as being too branded, especially in these iconic spaces in Berlin and Beijing, with these of a more subtle nature. So what's left of cultural criticism in this era of newly branded spaces that playfully avoid the branding pitfalls of the past? Cultural analysts can, I believe, produce diligent research that addresses the interesting parallels of mythic semiotics, of the sort that Roland Barthes references, and contemporary unbranding in public space. The development of new mobile applications that allow an individual to identify store products that may be linked to politically problematic companies or to use their money and social resources to affect social causes are signs of an increasing immersion of mobile media space with political activism. One could say that a similar, though slower effect is taking place in the public space of consumption. During my time spent on a celebrity cruise ship in 2010, I was struck by an interesting section of the ship that was notably not as well populated as the theaters, pools, nightclubs, and restaurants of the ship. It was called Team Earth, and it featured a computer terminal that allowed the user to calculate his or her carbon footprint in various arenas of life. This was, incidentally, not working during my time on the ship. And numerous boards there highlighted concerns with climate change, the environment, and related forms of social responsibility. As I perused these displays, I was quite curious about the extent to which the space on board the ship impacted the political consciousness of the many other guests. It seemed odd to me at first, and I was critical of it, but this seemed too cynical. After all, Celebrity was highlighting environmental concerns, albeit aboard a large ship that had an especially large carbon footprint in the big scheme of things. At the time, I thought of anthropologist George Marcus's notion of ethnographic complicity, which he suggests retains its ethical issues, but does so in a way that forces a rethinking of the space and positioning of the anthropologist-informant relationship that is at the heart of fieldwork as it has been commonly conceived. I might also note that aboard the Celebrity cruise ship were a number of interestingly themed guest bathrooms, many of which were adorned with quotes of famous authors and philosophers. And I have to say, you may not be able to read this, but this was my very first experience in a public consumer space in feeling an affinity with Nietzsche. An affinity above the urinal of all places, which I think is kind of fitting in some ways for Nietzsche. And this leads me, briefly, to a consideration of some of the additional emphases that we may see in consumer spaces in the future. These aren't necessarily speculative, and thus I have dedicated less attention to these particular forms. They are somewhat of a work in progress. I argue that this set of possibilities of both space and its analytic critique is an imminent one, and in some ways these could emerge as a result of both the breakdown of consumer space and the nature of research itself. The first of these is what I would call emergent reflexivity. In additional work under development, I am interested in analyzing the possibilities that reflexivity, or the deep focus on the self and its complicity in systems of power, domination, and control, offers for space, organizations, and communities. The connection of this concept to space and social research is quite profound. In the 1980s, many aspects of ethnographic theory shifted attention to the benefits of reflexivity in ethnographic and fieldwork contexts. Reflexivity has vast potential in space, and in many ways, it has been deployed to considerable success in consumer venues. Even a simple thing, like allowing a guest to input his or her name into a device that opens up the idea of transforming a depersonalized experience into a more reflexive one, is a good beginning. Efforts at a number of recent World Expos suggest that more designers are open to these approaches. And that's actually me pictured there on one of these Disney rides. No doubt, such continued uses will also establish new precedents for reflexive research approaches that combine the early 1980s concerns with the ideas that are actually emerging from the new reflexive rides, attractions, and theme spaces of the future. Connecting back to my talk yesterday on history in the theme park, I'm reminded of models of reflexivity in consumer space that connect to live theming and the sensibilities of individuals involved in historical reenactment. One concept that I have not covered extensively is the idea of a relational space. Relational space refers to any use of space as a meeting place, a gathering of imminent possibility, not a place of final action or clear intent. There are two significant works in this sense of the relational. The first is psychologist Kenneth Gergen's Relational Being, a text that develops an account of human action that replaces the presumption of bounded selves with a vision of relationship. The second is a highly influential text by Nicolas Bourdieu, Relational Aesthetics. Bourdieu's sense of the aesthetics centers on a set of artistic practices which take as their theoretical and practical point of departure the whole of human relations and their social context, rather than an independent and private space. In both of these senses of the relational, the one at the center of being and consciousness, the other at the site of aesthetic practice, we see the possibility of expressive connection to theories of consumer space. Some theme spaces of the present, such as certain non-traditional museums, have already developed these possibilities of relational space. But I believe that more such possibilities of theme parks and other theme spaces that depart from the individual or family focus of the space with literal A to B meaning, and that emphasize the use of the space as a jumping off point for relational possibility, is indeed a key. For analysts, particularly anthropologists, these spaces will likely inspire further breakdown of the harsh, self-other dialectic within research. And pictured here simply is saying in the traditional space, there's this literal one-to-one model of semiotics, or meaning the guest gets the meaning. In more relational space, such as Dennis Seaver's or Museum of Jurassic Technology, the guest is thrown into this Gadamer'ian model. And if you follow Gadamer's point about the hermeneutic circle, there's a jumping off point, you come back into the circle, and meaning is always imminent. It's always happening. It's never at a final point. And of course, Derrida in his critiques would also offer this same notion. And not unrelated to relational space is mobility and liquidity. I've spoken to some extent on the uses of mobility in space, particularly as mobile media is involved. But here I'm concerned with the overarching philosophical and conceptual aspects of consumer space as a mobile construction. The influences of transmedia, as Henry Jenkins has offered, offers possibilities of consumer spatial forms that are no longer bounded by one domain, such as a particular themed restaurant on a particular street in a particular city, and also not bounded by one form, such as an eatery where the guest sits down and has a meal among all the thematic elements. In new spaces, meanings, which include those behind the theming, those of the particular story of the space, the tie-in with other branding or consumer forms, meanings will be transformed into narratives that extend beyond and connect with greater conceptual, semiotic, and existential possibilities and potentials. Connected to mobility is the idea of liquidity, which is a significant postmodern foundation suggested by sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. Bauman's metaphor of the liquid has vast potential beyond the conceptual level. Especially fascinating could be the possibility of consumer space and activity within it losing its traditional connection with the semiotic referent, further extending transmedia possibilities of new narratives within those spaces. For the cultural analysts, there is the dream of working within a new consumer world that lacks the traditional foundations that once established the very idea of critique. No longer would we have a monolithic, archetypal Disney theme park ride space. And in its place, the critic develops models of what may be called ethnographic flux, paralleling the spirit of fluxus art of the 1960s. The study of authenticity and consumer experience is one of the most significant concerns of recent years, both in terms of the academic and methodological concerns with the concept and the idea of its use in spatial and experiential senses. I believe that authenticity will continue to transform how the consumer space appears and how it is studied by the analysts. I have spoken with many themed designers who are creating new spaces in mind that reflect the play of multiplicities in their spaces. Designers of a new resort in Egypt, as an example, express that they actively refer to the various referents of Egypt, including the many material and cultural sites of Egypt and its representation in venues like the Luxor Las Vegas. Given that designers have begun to jettison the stereotypical and foundational models of previous theme spaces, critics, as well, would do well with developing new analytical approaches that move beyond the so-called authentic forms of social critique of the past. I might then refer to the sum of these efforts to deconstruct the problematic concept of authenticity in spatial design and its role in the genesis of many forms of cultural critique and edict or outsiders-based models as post-authenticity. In a keynote address that I gave some time ago at the Theme Entertainment Association's SATE, which stands for Storytelling, Architecture, Technology, Experience, at the SATE conference, I mediated on the notion of a confessional booth that could be used to bridge the noticeable gap between academics who study themed and immersive spaces and designers who create them. I realize that confessional booths are somewhat heavy and burdensome in terms of their existential import. And perhaps this is why no one at the conference jumped on the idea of setting up such a venue. But consider how more dialogue between the academics of theming and the designers of theming could result in innovative spaces and innovative social research. I would suggest that such dialogue and resultant impacts on each of the other's work, the space in one context, the critique and methodology in the other, would result in forms of intervention that illustrate mesoforms and the middle voice. Mesoforms are ones that appear in the space or at the space between high theoretical formations and the on-the-ground deployments of method, while the middle voice references a conceptual space which resists the urges of the SVO, or subject-verb-object, constructs of language in which an actor acts, often violently, on an object. In the place of the SVO model is a middle voice in which the actor or speaker is not acting on the world, but is in the midst of it. At a conference in Copenhagen, I began work on a model of intervention that operates at this level of the tension between the designer of consumer space and the academic of consumer space. In its initial form, my research effort relates to the creation of an experimental consulting operation known as culture space. I envisioned the space as a middle between the material spaces of theming and immersion and the metaspace of its critique, and one in which new possibilities emerge. Radical, unsettling, perhaps too challenging for the designer to envision, too difficult to be enacted in a material sense, too risky for the guest to interact with, and too uncanny for the cultural critic to engage with. Here is one example of an additional experiment with consumer spatial research and narrative form that I refer to you today. I do not have time to read it, but it is based on my use of a tiny, nondescript I Love Power mug from a now-defunct Las Vegas gift shop. I have since developed this essay into an experimental video essay. Such work suggests a middle voice approach in that the ethnographer's voice is contingent on this mug, a sort of objet petit a in Lacan or Slavoj Žižek's terms. And the entirety of the ethnographic account is based on the notion of a constituent approach to the field. The sense of the middle voice and mesoforms suggests to me a return to the initial statement of the loss of control of the researcher's research, and, by corollary, the loss of control of the designer's consumer space. In the conceptual and material spaces of intersection, crossroads, and cross-pollination, both sides in this important discussion of consumer spaces have to contend with being in the middle and being in the midst, as opposed to being in control. In this liminal space, as anthropologist Victor Turner has called it, both parties discover a new sense of being, as a realization of new forms, new methods, and new dialogue and debate emerges. What rises to the surface in this space is the sense of lateralization, or an equalization of voices within the space. This does not imply agreement of the parties participating in the dialogue, but a meeting and conversation among the muses, as anthropologist Stephen A. Tyler has suggested in numerous sources, and most notably in his book, The Unspeakable. I believe that there is much more at stake than the debate over how new consumer spaces will be constituted, or how the cultural analyst will consider them, and in this middle realm of politics, of social justice. I will save additional discussion as to how politics and social justice can play a part in the world of consumer space, which has been decidedly apolitical and often opposed to forms of social justice in any of its appearances within space. And again, you can hear this next week in my talk, Theme Parks, Cultural Remaking to Social Justice. Until then, to return to my initial thoughts, I argue that the circumstance in which the researcher experiences the sense of a loss of control in terms of the dynamics of the research may result in some of the greatest potentials for work in consumer spaces to come. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, I don't know where to. Okay, Daka.
Thank you very much for a talk which, like a journey, took us from very traditional consumer spaces to alternative spaces, which also, I think, took us from very traditional ways of publishing research to very alternative ways of publishing research. And I think if there's got to be a dialogue between theme space designers and theme space researchers, you've definitely done your part. So now let's hope that Disney will send someone else other than security.
Perhaps.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Yeah, we do have some time for questions. So I open the floor. And
thank you, first of all, very much for that interesting talk.
Thank you.
My question concerns the notion of authenticity, and you spoke about post-authenticity, and I would like to know, how would you conceptualize authenticity with regard to post-authenticity? Like, one could maybe say, if we don't really know what authenticity is, how can we know what post-authenticity is? And what does it matter at all?
Yeah. I think this is a great question, and I think it's very tricky because on the one hand I would say, if we're talking about authenticity in the sense of the philosophical notion, I would refer to Heidegger's notion of authenticity, and I would talk about this idea of, the fusion of the horizons of temporality, and this notion of, if one is going to be truly authentic in the world, again, this is a philosophical definition, one would lead one's life in such a way that the channels of information, the memes, the images, the sources, the dialogues with people wouldn't directly influence their sense of being. Now, the problem with this Heideggerian definition is that if you go to a typical consumer space, right, whether it's the Gap or Starbucks or Disney or some lifestyle store, everything about it, I would suggest, is counter to a Heideggerian definition of authenticity, or most analysts who would consider authenticity in a philosophical or in a cultural sense. So the divide, I believe, to me, is that I think we need to bring into the debate, into the fray here, more of that existential notion of authenticity, bring those into the spaces, and thus we get this notion of post-authenticity. The second track, though, of authenticity, and I refer you to Pine and Gilmore's text called Authenticity, What Consumers Really Want. The tricky thing in this text, and I didn't talk about it, I didn't have the space, but they discuss not only the philosophical models of authenticity, they discuss the critiques of authenticity, including the models of Baudrillard and Walter Benjamin. And so they're very wary, I would say almost sly, in how they present the critiques of authenticity and then make this argument for we need to move into this new world. They don't necessarily call it post-authenticity. I believe I'm calling this post-authenticity because, for me, there isn't one model that captures these different worlds of authenticity. Somehow I want to create this model of a dialogue between the philosophical notions of authenticity of Heidegger and many others, and these consumer models of authenticity of Pine and Gilmore and the others who speak of this idea of, a space that speaks to the consumer. The divide, as I talk about in this talk today, is the critic, I think, will always come to being at odds with the type of authenticity that is advocated by the designer of the consumer space versus maybe what he or she has at heart, being a graduate student and reading, Gadamer and Heidegger and all these other sources who suggest a much more complex semiotic, existential, and cultural model. So I think the trick here is to say, what model of authenticity? And are we speaking of the consumer, the social critic? Could the two, to use my confessional booth, meet at the middle and have some sort of dialogue? So I'm afraid I can't adequately answer this because I think that we have to speak of at what point in time and at what actor is using this reference to authenticity when we speak of it in a consumer space versus in a philosophical sense. So I find this very challenging, your question. It's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome, yeah. Yes.
There's a concern in terms traditional and original.
Yeah.
Okay, because I read from this, if you talk about traditional or original spaces, use the terms, this is a traditional original space too, isn't it?
This being...
It's brand new, it's just...
Oh yes, I see.
It's quite new ideas.
Right. Right. So I think what I'm trying to suggest is that what I would define as a traditional space would be any space that is like the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, right? I say traditional meaning that the cultural, philosophical, existential foundations of the space are in line with what is typical. And what is typical would be this idea that the meaning is A to B and linear. The guest is a consumer in the space. The guest is never once told he or she must deal with their complicity in systems of domination by being a consumer in that space. That's traditional. Non-traditional avant-garde would be Dennis Seaver's house or 139 Norfolk Street or Museum of Jurassic Technology. Those are spaces that if you follow them, I believe, I said this yesterday, I believe they spatialize Nietzsche or they spatialize Gadamer, they spatialize Derrida, because in a way they're not linear. They're not A to B. The meaning is much more rhizomatic, or if we use Umberto Eco's terms, of the open work, there's open meaning versus the closed meaning. Pirates of the Caribbean, I believe, I don't see any other way around it. If you're going through the ride, it follows in Echo's notion of the open and closed work. It's a closed work. It's what Roland Barthes would call a writerly text. The writer determines the meaning. What I would say is the non-traditional space would be avant-garde, and it would be a readerly text. If we were talking about a text, it's a spatial text, but it's one in which the meaning is transformed, and presumably the guest is transformed. And I would say some of the interpretive centers around the world, beyond the ones I spoke of, the many Holocaust museums, the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles, are at many levels developing meaning that is well beyond these, quote, traditional spaces. I would argue, though, that my dichotomy is a bit too harsh, traditional and non-traditional, or traditional and these new spaces. But it was my way, I guess, of trying to establish the notion of these two different types of spaces. So I think it's too harsh of a dichotomy, perhaps, yeah.
I have another question in this context, because I think, our customs with using media or something, they are changing. And I think at one point, if we are accustomed to all this use of media, walking to theme spaces, which are in general similar, because sometimes our expectations are changing. And this issue of unexpected, not traditional, and other kind, I think it's changing because our expectations are changing too. And so it can be, you have something like traditional, and it's unexpected by the visitor, because they do not accept this in this place, And so I think that's maybe something for the different one.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question, and I think the issue again goes back to this notion of will the designers change and offer new models of space? Will the guest accept it? Is the guest operating under the traditional paradigms or principles of how they interact with space? You could clearly have a guest who goes to a space and it's uncomfortable, and I'll talk about this in my talk next week, so this could be a curious departure.